Hi, this is Street Life and I'm Natasha, back at it with a review and discussion of The Untouchables. The Untouchables is a film that by now I've watched several times. Kevin Costner has also been in some pretty good action movies. One of my favorite movies, which we can argue about how good it is The Bodyguard. And this movie here, certainly he's playing a different role, but I was thinking to myself as I was watching, Kevin Costner's been in some pretty good films. He's had a pretty good film career. And in the case of The Untouchables, we're really have an all-star cast. So you have Kevin Costner, of course, but Sean Connery, Robert De Niro, Andy Garcia, several other really big names. And pretty much what you have at play here is kind of like this good guys versus bad guys, or rather cops and robbers kind of thing, where Kevin Costner plays Eliot Ness, so the lawman Eliot Ness, while Robert De Niro plays Al Capone. The film takes place during the Prohibition Era, and it's pretty much about Eliot Ness and his team's campaign to bring down Al Capone. This would be during Prohibition, when in America alcohol had been outlawed. So you had this temperance movement, and in response to that, alcohol was deemed illegal. Unfortunately, when you outlaw vices of this nature, it tends to then result in a black market developing, especially in the case of alcohol where it had previously been legal. And so what you end up having is that alcohol, the sale and distribution of alcohol, was previously overseen and managed by the government, and you now have this thing where it's become like a black market commodity, where criminals are now managing the sale of liquor, making a lot of money doing it. And in the case of things like that, you now run the risk of having violence, so wars as they fight for control of territory. It's criminal enterprises. When there are disagreements, sometimes one of their tools for solving problems is violence. And this is pretty much where you have the emergence of gangland Chicago. Well, prior to Prohibition, you certainly had criminals and criminal enterprises, but with Prohibition, things became more organized. Things kind of broke out more into the open. You frequently had citizens getting caught up in the crossfire between gangsters, where even in the early years of Prohibition, when gangsters were killing each other, you had, these were referred to as gangland shootings, meaning rival crews were shooting it out. And it was pretty much regarded as long as the criminals were keeping this violence and whatnot amongst themselves, as long as it was gangsters killing gangsters, that's their business. But now, as they say, bullets don't have names. And unfortunately, what started happening was that innocent citizens started getting caught up in these exchanges, especially as these shootouts and firefights became more brazen. It started to move beyond just shootouts to bombings and other acts of violence where innocent people would more readily be caught in the crossfire. And you now have this greater push for something to be done about this, for these criminals to be brought to heel. And Al Capone emerged from during Prohibition as one of the big leaders, one of the key figures within this industry of the illicit sale of alcohol. And he's portrayed rather charismatically by Robert De Niro with these nicely tailored suits. When the film came out in the 90s, he was sort of the film came out in the 90s, but he was sort of the representation of the Italian mobster. It makes for an interesting film where you have the criminals on the one side, so Al Capone and his organization. We see him, certainly, but we don't really follow him as much as the story follows Eliot Ness and his men. So the film starts off with Ness, as you would find with some of these movies and TV shows, putting together this task force. There's an underlying current within this investigation, which is that given the flow of alcohol, it's resulted in a flow of money, which is then resulting in favor and privilege, right? Many people being in cahoots with Al Capone and his organization. So police officers, agents, people involved with the government who are supposed to be upholding the law are instead taking bribes. And then, they're working on behalf of Al Capone to help him and his criminal empire. You have this underlying thing where you have to be careful about who you trust from an investigative standpoint. As a police officer, federal agent, pretty much Ness can't trust the Chicago police because a lot of them are on the take. And there's very little trust within the justice system because judges, lawyers, and whatnot are also on the take because there's so much money at play. You have this thing of Ness has to put together a team. But as part of that, he has to be very careful about who he adds to the team because it's dangerous work that they're doing. So you can't have people that, aren't brave on the team. But complicating things is that you need people who are trustworthy. And this is where the name the Untouchables comes from, meaning these are individuals whose moral compass, whose principles are such that they can be entrusted to investigate Al Capone and his organization, but there's no risk of them being corrupted. There's no risk of them taking bribes and passing along information to Capone or his people. Because that's been a key problem in trying to bring charges against Capone. He's been able to skate on multiple charges. And as we find out from this film, a large part of that is paying out bribes to politicians, police officers, lawyers, other people within the justice system, including judges, right? And so over the course of the film, or rather the bedrock of the film, this person who's so well known for things like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and these other really atrocious acts of violence, that he would be taken down. He's not taken down for murder or something along these lines. He's certainly been charged, been under suspicion for several murders and acts of violence. He'd been under investigation for bootlegging, the transportation of alcohol and whatnot, but none of those charges really stuck. What's known is that this was a guy that committed various criminal acts, but he went to prison for tax evasion. Tax evasion is something that you think of as what we've come to refer to as white-collar crime, where it's someone that works in an office or lives a regular life. That's the kind of crime that they would be convicted of. But here it is that you have this guy who's the leader of this large criminal enterprise, trafficking in illegal goods, but also carrying out all kinds of murders, raising all kinds of mayhem. And here it is that he gets convicted for tax evasion. Seems pretty ironic, right? That here's this powerful underboss, and this is the thing that brings him down. Not paying his taxes, not claiming income. And so that becomes sort of really a running joke all these decades later. But this thing of you might be a bad guy. You might be out here shooting it out with people and carrying on in the streets and whatnot, but you most certainly don't want any problems with the IRS. The task force was put together. And there's a few scenes where they investigate, they're trying to find out, to really gain an understanding of the components of Capone's organization. Because he's certainly running a criminal enterprise, but it's very well organized. It's out in the open, but the inner workings are somewhat hidden. Because they can't be obvious about, having money out in the street and things like that. Obviously, he's living this lifestyle that there's no real accounting for with regards to how he's making money to afford this lifestyle, which raises some questions. But he's taken steps to kind of hide his finances as best as possible, or rather to hide the operations of his organization. And so a part of the film is not just finding the alcohol, but also developing an understanding of how the organization works. And so as part of this, what becomes the linchpin of this investigation is to locate Capone's accountant, because this is the person that, for lack of a better term, knows where the bodies are buried. You've tried already, others have tried already to get him for murders, to get him for acts of violence, for bootlegging, and none of those charges have stuck. But this time, they're going to go after him. They're going to follow the money instead of following the bodies. And watching it this time, the movie kind of reminded me of The Wire, where the police are investigating. They start, following drugs, following bodies, gaining an understanding of how these different criminal enterprises operate, who the players are and whatnot. But as part of that as well, things really heated up when they started to follow the money. Following the money took them further up the ranks. They began to notice payoffs being made to lawyers and politicians, and they noticed just how things are functioning, developing an understanding of how the money flows. Sure, it comes off the street, and you might arrest street level dealers. There'll be someone else there to take their place in no time. But it's if you want to get up the chain, if you want to make a real difference, have an effective impact, you want to get the people higher up in the organization, because quite often when you catch those big fish, when you put them in jail, granted there's some pros and cons to that, but as it can lead to bedlam, but part of that is that it can often disrupt the flow of the organization. The organization can often fall into disarray. And so when you have these arrests of like the big timers, there's certainly the opportunity to arrest like these lower level bootleggers, these people who are running the alcohol. But the focus, the goal is really on getting Capone, because there's several big fish, but for the time he is the biggest. And the hope is that by capturing him, that it would disrupt his organization. It would disrupt this flow of alcohol into the country, because he controls so much of the market, because he's the most visual boss within this illicit industry. And so what you have is a really interesting investigation where you have this team, each of them, if you think of it, it's like superhero teams where they each have their superpower. In the case of Eliot Ness and his team, each one of them has like a superpower, a thing that they're known for. You have like the sharpshooter. You have Ness, who's a great team leader. You have Sean Connery, who's like the old grizzled police officer, who's walked the beat for years. And at this incorruptible. And then you have the accountant who can dig into the finances, who can dig into the operations and figure things out. So it's like each one of them brings some kind of skill to the team. And this is the thing, putting together a task force, or the advantage to having task force is that each member of the team, they bring some kind of expertise. Whereas having just one person or a duo investigating this by himself or by themselves probably wouldn't be able to get this far. But by putting together this task force where you have a bunch of specialists here taking part in this investigation, it's like they're able to attack this organization from all sides. Part of it is that you have this criminal enterprise that, like, if you think of it as like an octopus with various tentacles, or like Medusa, that's what you have going on here, right? Where sure, at the center of it, at the middle of it, you have Al Capone. But he has like Frank Nitti, he has his accountant, he has various henchmen, and it's like he has all of these people in his orbit that contribute to the operation of his organization. If Eliot Ness is to have any chance at bringing him down, he needs a team of his own. And so seeing the team come together, seeing them investigate, it makes for a very exciting movie. You have like shootouts and things like that, which is to be expected from these kinds of films. You have like your boss and all this kind of stuff, but at the same time, you have just like some really good police work. And one of the things that I like with these older type of films, not to say like, movies that came out in, I want to say 90s, but with these films that take place some years in the past, is the reliance on good police work versus technology. Not that there's anything wrong with technology, but these kinds of films are refreshing. It's like you don't have technology as a fallback, as you might see with like CSI and some of these other shows. And it makes for like a fresh and different take. And it's a movie that I highly recommend. Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist. Go ahead and click the thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.